On the morning of July 1st, 1863, students in Pennsylvania Hall have no reason to think today will be different from any other day. As they file into their classrooms, the first shots of the Battle of Gettysburg crack somewhere west of town. And by nightfall, the building everyone calls Old Dorm would belong to the wounded and the dying. For 3 days, the hall's cupola, once a bell tower, becomes a lookout with a sightline over the entire town. Confederate and Union surgeons work inside the same rooms where lectures were given hours earlier, and the wooden floors of Pennsylvania Hall would soak up more blood than any building on campus. And when the guns finally go quiet, the college eventually goes back to being a college. But Pennsylvania Hall never quite goes back to being just a building. Today we take a look at Pennsylvania Hall, the grand old building on the Gettysburg College campus, the place where the school's proud founding story, its darkest days, and its ghostly sightings share the same address. So if you're curious, let's take a walk through history. Reverend Samuel Simon Schmucker was a German-American Lutheran preacher who had been lobbying for a proper seminar to train Lutheran ministers in English. He pushed the idea through the General Synod, and Gettysburg was chosen partly because of its large German Lutheran population and a $7,000 incentive from the borough. The Lutheran Theological Seminary opened September 5, 1826, with just 8 students. Within a year, Schmucker realized incoming students weren't academically ready for seminary-level theology. So on June 25, 1827, he opened a prep school, naming it the Gettysburg Gymnasium, an old German classical term for a college prep academy. The gymnasium grew quickly, and Schmucker sought a state charter to formalize it as a full college. When the college reached 98 students and had no more room for additional enrollment, Pennsylvania legislator Thaddeus Stevens pushed a funding bill through the State House and sold the college 6 acres of his own land for $528. Construction on a new building began that April, and the keys were handed over in October of 1837. Students moved into the building for the November term, and everyone on campus started calling it Old Dorm. 26 years later, Old Dorm's purpose on campus would change dramatically. On July 1, 1863, war had come to Gettysburg, and by the end of the first day's battle, Old Dorm had changed from Union control to the Confederates. Chief Surgeon Samuel Morrison designated the building for the wounded of both armies. Among the men carried through its doors was Confederate Colonel Waller Tazewell Patton of the 7th Virginia Infantry, who was struck by an artillery shell during Pickett's charge that tore away his lower jaw. Nurse Euphemia Goldsboro, whom the soldiers called Miss Effie, used her own body to hold him upright when his wounds made it too hard for him to breathe. Patton died weeks later, one of roughly 700 men who passed through Pennsylvania Hall before the hospital finally moved out on July 29th. Only a handful of students had stayed on campus through the fighting. One of them, Michael Culver, spent those weeks treating the wounded well enough that soldiers started calling him doctor. Another student, returning to his room 3 days after the battle ended, found it holding 3 men instead of 1. one on the bed, two on the floor, and every hallway in the building filled with what he called the poor deluded sons of the South. Classes resumed that September, but Old Dorm kept giving up pieces of the battle for years afterward. Bullets, bones, and blood-stained books turned up in and around the building for decades. Old Dorm officially became Pennsylvania Hall in 1898, when the college finally wrote the new name into its catalog, but the Old Dorm nickname never really left. Gettysburg College's most famous ghost tale doesn't come from a dusty diary or a legend passed down since the war. It comes from the 1980s and the Pennsylvania Hall elevator. Two campus administrators stayed late one night, boarded the elevator, and pressed the button for the first floor. The car started down but kept going past the first floor, straight to the basement. When the doors opened, the administrators weren't looking at Penn Hall's modern basement. Instead, they saw an active Civil War hospital, bloodied floors, wounded men on cots, and a surgeon mid-operation with a saw in hand. But possibly the most frightening aspect of the scene was that the doctor and nurses seemed to react to the administrators on the elevator, as if the spirits were witnessing something that was as unreal to them as they were to those on the lift. The administrators pressed every button they could until the doors finally shut again, and when they reached the ground floor, they sent a security guard back down to check, only to find that the basement was empty. Former Gettysburg battlefield ranger Mark Nesbitt put the story into print in his Ghosts of Gettysburg book series, and it's been retold ever since. Sometimes as two administrators, sometimes as three young assistant professors, but always the same elevator, and always the same scene waiting in the basement. And they weren't the last ones to see it. In the early 2000s, a student named John took that same ride late one night. It says the doors opened on the exact same hospital. The story's still going, decades after the first account. But not everyone's convinced. There's no documented paranormal activity tied to Pennsylvania Hall anywhere in the historical record from the war itself or the decades that followed it. The elevator story doesn't surface until the 1980s, well over a century after the battle. Whether that makes it a genuine haunting or a story that grew out of a building that earned its reputation the hard way, Pennsylvania Hall carries both possibilities inside the same walls. For me, there's also something that doesn't quite feel right. In 1863, lighting was poor. Field doctors would typically work outside using sunlight to aid their surgery, and their patients would then be transported into the nearest building to recover. And it's almost certain that a dark basement would be the worst place for a surgical procedure. It's not to say, however, that the vision the administrators witnessed was a basement scene per se. It may be that they were transported into a portal, which would account for the doctors' and nurses' reaction to their presence. We may never know what was truly witnessed in the basement of Pennsylvania Hall, but if the tales are true, it must have been a frightening sight for both sides. Pennsylvania Hall started as an answer to the problem of too many students and not enough room. In July of 1863, it saw the worst of humankind, and those two identities have never fully separated. Walk through its halls today, and you're walking through the school's proudest chapter and its darkest one, sharing the same foundation, the same hallways, maybe the same elevator. If you find yourself on campus, look for Old Dorm. It's still standing, serving as an administrative building, and depending on who you ask, still holds a few things that never quite left. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time as we explore more curious history. Take care.